Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Chris Gassman. I'm with the Center for Sustainable Business, and we're here today for one of our lunch strategy primers. Thank you all for joining us here for another conversation with the Center. And if you haven't, please go ahead, if you just joined us, use the chat, add your name, say hello, say where you're coming in from. We'd love to hear from you. And we'd love to see each of you checking in with each other. I mean, we're here talking about ESG, so let's disclose. And apropos to our conversation today, we would like to begin by disclosing that the University of Pittsburgh occupies the ancestral lands of the Dina culture, the Hopewell culture, the Monongahela peoples, and many colonization refugees from other tribes who later joined them. By becoming aware of and respecting the histories of indigenous peoples in the US, people can learn a lot to not repeat about what happened in the past, while also working towards a future in which we respect, revere, and live in harmony with the people who were here first, as well as the future generations we are borrowing the land from. So with that, we are excited to dive in to our conversation today. If anyone does have any feedback about the conversation or ideas, critiques, or interests, feel free to reach out to me on email, LinkedIn, always invite the conversation. For this conversation today, we have a group lined up to really talk through and help key out some of the wicked problems that are impeding environmental, social, governance, or ESG literacy. If you want more info on their bios and their backgrounds, it's on the website. We'll have that in the show notes, and we'll have that later going out as well to save on all of that. This is the best of the best. We're excited for the conversation, and really want to save the time for audience to engage in the Q&A and conversation. So if I haven't mentioned it yet, please do. As we're going through this, add your questions to the Q&A. That's going to be the easiest way for us to capture any questions that you all have. If you throw it in the chat, we can try and get to it, but the Q&A will be far more effective at capturing and making sure we flag any of those conversations. I would feel remiss at being in an academic institution if we didn't tee up some interesting, provocative insights before bringing in the guests. So, just some to think about it from a variety of different perspectives would be, thinking about how companies interact with investors. Companies often think that they're disclosing everything they need to, and investors are often left feeling that they have a lot to desire on that front, and they're not getting the kind of quality that they're looking for. Similarly, when we look at boards and the kind of competency that we would expect of boards often think that they are fully competent and have everything that they need. Whereas a lot of recent studies have been showing that they often don't have the kind of experience for the challenges that companies are facing today. Similarly, consumers don't have the guidance that they need. They really need some knowledge, and they're willing to pay more. So they have some gaps in their literacy as well. And then finally, on the employee front, not only are they willing and interested in upskilling, they also are often lacking in understanding of the company's efforts or goals and how they can be a part of them. So those are just some examples of ways that and some of the barriers that folks are running into in literacy. But with that, we'd love to turn it over to Professor Christensen, bring him onto the stage, because Dan, I know you've got some amazing provocative insights to share from your research. So with that, hand it over to you.
All right, well, thanks. Let me go and share my screen here, and we'll just get going. All right, can you guys see my slides? Is that coming through? All right.
Perfect.
Let's see. All right, well, thanks for the chance to talk here about some of the wicked challenges that exist in the ESG space. So I'm Dane Christensen from the University of Oregon, and I'll be presenting some research that I recently published with some of my colleagues at Harvard, George Serafim and Siko Sikochi. And honestly, there's a variety of challenges in this ESG space, but my discussion today is just going to focus on a few of them. In particular, in this project, what we're trying to get a better handle on is why is it that the various ESG rating agencies can't really seem to agree on which companies are socially responsible? And just let me give you a little bit of background on the topic as to why we think this is a big deal. So when people go out and they invest their money in a bunch of stocks, many of them want to earn more than just a good financial return. They just want to know also that the businesses that they're investing in are operating in a socially responsible way. They don't want to be investing in companies that are harming the environment or committing human rights abuses or things like that. So to help investors identify companies who are operating in a socially responsible way, a number of rating agencies have been emerging over the years. And these ratings that they provide give an assessment about how well a company is managing its environmental, social, and governance risks and opportunities. And honestly, this is big business. So if you look in 2018, for example, investors spent over $500 million just to get these ratings and the underlying data that these data providers have been collecting. And according to recent estimates, we've now got over 30 trillion in assets under management that are invested using some sort of sustainable strategy applying ESG criteria. So it seems like ESG ratings are a useful tool for guiding socially responsible investing decisions. But unfortunately, there is a problem, and that is that the ratings that any given company receives tend to vary drastically depending on which rating agency that the rating is coming from. And so you can kind of see this if you look in a recent Wall Street Journal article where they were talking about this. They said, when we measure how different ESG providers rate companies in the S&P 500, there's often little overlap. By contrast, when rating agencies score those same companies for their creditworthiness, they are much more often in agreement. And these points are illustrated in the following graphics. So if on the left, you've got ratings from 2 ESG rating agencies, and on the right are ratings from 2 credit rating agencies. When the raters agree, you should see a tight diagonal line and a high R squared. So on the right, that's what you see for credit rating agencies. But on the left, for the ESG rating agencies, their ratings are kind of all over the place. So why is it that these ESG rating agencies can't really agree? And that's really what we want to get a better handle of. So since we are accounting researchers, we decided just to try to examine the role that information plays in this disagreement. I mean, specifically, we wanted to focus on the extent of firms' ESG disclosures because we thought, well, theory suggests that when disagreement happens, it's usually because people either have different information sets or they just have different interpretations of information. And honestly, conventional wisdom usually just would argue, and honestly, we've seen this in a lot of other settings, like when we look at analysts and how they interpret information that's provided to them in the financial context. But basically, what we'll see typically is that as there's more and more disclosure that's being provided, we typically see disagreement going away because disclosure starts to give everyone the same information, so we're all on the same page, right? But we argue that in this setting, due to the subjective nature of ESG information, we would expect the opposite to be true, where greater disclosure would actually increase disagreement because disclosure expands opportunities just to have different interpretations of information. I mean, essentially, it's giving you more things to disagree about. Just to kind of illustrate this, in the absence of disclosure, these data providers, they're more likely to agree just because they'll have simple rules of thumb for what to do when there's no disclosure. So, if a company doesn't disclose about some issue that's really important and widespread in an industry, the raters are likely to see that as a bad sign and view that as bad performance in that area. Or, for an area that is less significant, and there's not a whole lot of companies who disclose stuff about that in the industry, they're probably going to view that as something that's really just not that important, and they'll just assign the company's performance to be, the average of the industry. Now, in contrast, if a company does start to provide more and more ESG disclosure, the data providers are going to have to make a judgment about whether or not that's good performance or bad performance. So, for example, let's say a company was to disclose lost time injury rates or number of fatalities on the job. Once those disclosures go out there, now companies are going to have to be judged on that. And this gives rise to a level of subjectivity that increases as more and more things are being disclosed because there's a variety of metrics that are coming out. So let's imagine this happens. If you're trying to evaluate, is this good or bad performance when you're thinking about injuries or fatalities, what should the benchmark be? Should it be the industry average? Should it be last year's performance for the firm? Should it be 0? Is any level of fatality too much? How much improvement is adequate from year to year? What's the right answer on that? We're all, as a society, still trying to grapple with that and come to an agreement about how to interpret this kind of stuff. So we would argue that as firms are providing more and more disclosure, this is honestly just increasing opportunities for disagreement. And if you look in sociology research, they argue that when you are in a field where it's kind of new or it's been newly emerging, we're likely to go see a variety of evaluations of how to interpret the information until rules and norms get developed so we're all kind of on the same page. So basically, this led us to believe that in this space, we're likely to go and see greater ESG disclosure, leading the rating agencies to disagree more and more with each other. So to test the prediction, what we did is we analyzed data from 3 of the largest ESG rating agencies. We got MSCI's IBA ratings, Sustainalytics ratings, and then Thomson Reuters ratings, which now goes by the name of Refinitiv since they got sold off. And then we got ESG disclosure scores from Bloomberg. So we took all this data, constructed a data set of like 30,000 firm years coming from 5,000 unique companies from over 69 different countries across the world. So we got roughly a 12-year time series of data that we're able to work with here. But before we actually went and tested our hypothesis, we first just want to get a sense for whether or not disagreement is something that has been increasing or decreasing over time. Because if it's been decreasing, then maybe this really isn't that big a deal anymore. It just might be resolving itself on its own as time goes on, if people are just starting to come to an agreement. But that's not what we found. When we will see here, as you can kind of see in this graph, that not only have ESG disclosure levels been increasing over time, as well as people's or firms' performance, we also see that disagreement about that performance has also been increasing over time as well. Now, honestly, these are just trends. There's nothing causal in what you see here. They just happen to be moving in similar directions, but we don't know whether or not that's actually really related to the disclosure. So to try to formally test our prediction, we performed multivariate analyses where we controlled for a variety of characteristics about these companies. We looked across firms, we looked within firms over time. And regardless of how we tested it, we basically found that the greater the firm's ESG disclosure level seemed to be, the greater the disagreement we started to observe for the rating agencies. And so this is all types of ESG disclosure. Then we try to drill down a little deeper, and we looked at each of the pillars of E, S, and G separately. And we see the same types of effects in each of those pillars, but really the effects were strongest, particularly in the social pillar, followed by the environmental pillar, which we didn't think is too surprising, given that those are a little bit newer to the block than governance. Governance has been an issue that's been debated for a longer period of time. But honestly, again, we're seeing all these associations, but we wanted to get a little bit more comfort that what we're capturing here is really causal. And there's no perfect way to do this. So what we did is we employed a natural experiment where we looked at when different countries or stock exchanges began mandating higher levels of ESG disclosure. And we basically treated those as shocks to companies in those locations. And so what we observed is that after a country implemented higher ESG disclosure requirements, we see that the affected companies increased their disclosures. And then right after that, we'll see an increase in ESG rating disagreement as a response. And we confirmed that these effects didn't kick in before the disclosure requirements. And so after seeing this happening staggered all over the world at various different points in time, it provided us with greater confidence that as of right now, this is what seems to be happening as firms disclose more and more information. So the next thing we did is we really wanted to drill down and figure out, well, let's look at the metrics that these rating agencies are using and try to figure out how does disagreement get influenced by the types of metrics that are being put out there. And what we did is we just categorized the metrics into just 2 simple categories, just to kind of get the ball rolling. One just being, are the metrics related to a policy that the firm has? These are what we would refer to as inputs. These are the efforts of the company to try to accomplish some goal. And then we also classified other metrics as outcomes, which is the performance outcome you would expect to observe if the policy is working, right? So, if the policy was, we want to go and enhance diversity at our company, the outcome metric would be, well, what percentage of your workforce is composed of women or of minorities or whatever else is that you're trying to accomplish. And so what we did is we looked at these metrics and we basically predicted and found that the rating agencies disagree a lot less about inputs or policies, right? If they see you've got a policy, that's a little more straightforward to interpret. You might disagree a little bit about how strong the policy is, but they disagreed a lot more once it came to interpreting the outcomes. Again, going back to the fatality rates, is this a good outcome? Is this not a good outcome? Or diversity, is this diverse enough, not diverse enough? So this is just consistent with the notion that evaluating outcomes is just more subjective, and it requires having a shared understanding of what is a good or a bad outcome. And then we saw that if you add more and more disclosure, it just exacerbates this disagreement about the metrics. And then the last thing we did is we just tried to explore some of the stock market consequences of this rating disagreement, just to see, does this matter? Do investors really get affected by this? So what we did is we performed a bunch of short window tests. We're looking like 3 days right around when ESG ratings are being released, and we see revisions in those ratings that changes the disagreement. And we found that greater rating disagreement was associated with even higher stock return volatility for those companies and greater stock price movements, which to us suggests that this disagreement is relevant to the stock market and influences stock prices. And then we looked over time and we saw that the effects appear to be becoming even stronger over time in general, which suggests this is having an increasing impact on the market. So overall conclusions, given the concerns that do exist over ESG rating disagreement, our findings suggest that greater disclosure does appear to, at this point in time, lead to greater disagreement amongst the rating agencies. So we would interpret this as suggesting that we as a society still have a lot of work to do to try to develop rules and norms for how to interpret good or bad ESG performance and decide on what metrics we should be using versus not using. And honestly, we would hope that this is just early stage evidence. Our assumption is as those rules and norms develop, we are going to hopefully see this relationship change to where greater disclosure would do what it does in other settings where it starts to resolve disagreement. And we think progress is going to be made as we see everyone trying to work towards that. So anyway, that's just one of the wicked problems that we see. I know there's a lot of other ones. So I just want to turn the time over to the other panelists and let them weigh in on issues like this or any other wicked issues they've found. So anyway, thank you much.
Awesome. Thank you, Dane. And your provocative insights have already provoked a number of questions from the panelists, or from the, we'll get to the questions from the panelists, but I've already inspired a number of questions from the audience. So we will get to those audience. We'll see if we can answer any of them by text in the interim. But first, coming from that investor perspective, we'd love to bring Amy on the stage. I know, Amy, in your work, you have done a lot of work with companies of all types, including working on the investor front and working with them without actually being in the investor's shoes yourself. So didn't know if you had any reactions to those insights or other wicked problems that you're seeing from your perspective.
Sure, and thanks for having me, especially on this panel with a bunch of World Business Council for Sustainable Development members, which is what we have here. So I'm relatively new to my organization. About 5 months ago, I joined. Before that, I was on the member side as well as Chief Sustainability Officer for Kellogg Company. So I issued bonds and answered all of these questions from investors and disclosed and all of those things. And you know, I think the research presented is a really interesting look at the complexity that disclosure has right now. I mean, it's fair. It's also really hard to interpret because, you know, many of the specific inputs or outputs that we're being asked to disclose now have not been around for 12 years. So it's also a constantly moving target of more disclosure on different things. And I think that's a real struggle to say, what does this mean and what does consensus mean when every year you're adding new metrics against ESG? And so, you know, it's a real moving target for companies. And as someone commented in the Q&A, it's not all about investors. Disclosure is for so many more people too, and it's for a number of stakeholders. So it's how do you say, is this net good disclosure, or is it, you know, net harming the business? Is a really complex one to try and measure. From a WBCSD perspective, we're pro disclosure. We think, you know, sunlight is important on these things, and we need to do better of making sure that the businesses who are being asked to do this are being able to reflect on what good disclosure looks like and what is it not. And how can we start to upskill ourselves, upskill regulators? I think it was interesting to see how the mandatory disclosure is part of the research, because that's also a new concept beyond the G, right? The G's been there for a while. So, as we start to move towards some of those and move away from voluntary disclosure frameworks, with the ISSB starting, which is a international sustainability standard organization to try and get regulation aligned on these topics, it's really key that we provide input as private sector to say, this is what will actually help you move the needle. That being said, there's also the other side of the aisle here that needs to be educated, which is the investor community. I've been on calls with investors who do not know what scope 1 and 2 operational boundary means. And so how do you compare two companies on their greenhouse gas emissions if you don't know what that means in practice, right? So, there's a huge opportunity to both make sure we're upskilling, that we are using materiality, big M materiality, the way that financial disclosure requires, to make sure we're reporting on the right things and not just whatever we feel like reporting. There's a role of regulatory, and then there's a role of education on the receiving end. So I think there's a lot of opportunity that this kind of conclusion represents, as well as a lot of nuance in kind of the subcomponents of E, S, and G and how those things change over time.
Awesome. Thank you, Amy. Appreciate the context from the overarching of many company perspectives that the World Business Council brings in. And so kind of teeing off that, Kevin, would love to bring you into the conversation. Know that you work a lot with boards and have, somewhat similar yet different conversations. How does this really resonate with what you're seeing? What are the wicked problems that you're seeing from your space that are impeding ESG literacy?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I would agree with a lot of things, that's been said already. As you mentioned, I lead our ESG practice at PwC, and so we're helping clients really take the theory and put it into action. And so, Dane, we would agree with your research around the rating agencies, right? There's a lot of challenge with those ratings, mostly around data quality, right? And so, as you mentioned, they're collecting different pieces of information, interpreting it differently. There's different weightings in each of the systems and models. So there's really not a standard way to rate those companies, and that's why we're seeing a lot of the disparity. And so, as Amy mentioned, we are absolutely pro disclosure, right? From our perspective, building trust in the capital markets is our foremost responsibility, right? And getting quality and investor grade reporting in non-financial reporting is very, very important to us. So I think a couple of the other problems that I'm seeing is we talked about data quality, so solving that will be really, really important. That will also be, I think, helped by a convergence of the standards and what each of the key components of E, S, and G are that we want to measure and track and make progress against. I think we're also seeing a shift from the sustainability officer being the primary point of contact and adding in others like the CFO and the CEO in a lot of cases, and that will drive more transparency, more accountability, more toward the financial reporting model that we're all used to, which should theoretically improve the transparency around all of that reporting. And then I think maybe the last point here is it's really a struggle still to collect all of these information. So Amy mentioned the education of folks, those folks that are collecting the information and those folks that are rating the information probably all could use some upskilling and learn more about all of these topics. But the other problem too is there's really no easy way yet to collect all of this information from a systems perspective. So obviously, Michael, I think we'll touch on here. A lot of the Alliance folks are really looking at how to do this from a systematic approach, but that will tremendously help us here.
Awesome. Thank you, Kevin. And perfect segue. So, Michael, I'd love to bring you into the conversation on that front. What are you seeing in terms of the kind of backbone infrastructure for figuring out, like, hey, how are we collecting the information in the first place?
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks, Chris, for having me. And yeah, I certainly agree with my fellow panelists on all their comments. Certainly pro disclosure. I think it really does build a lot of trust across a variety of stakeholders. But to Kevin's point around data quality, I would say I have not spoken to a client in the last year where that is not a consistent problem they're having. Like, they cannot get the data out of their systems to actually make informed decisions in a real-time capacity. You know, they're looking at things with a lag, you know, water, energy, whatever it happens to be. And it's a real struggle, not only for them as an organization, but for these big technology companies as well. They're trying to build solutions for their clients. So it's everything from SAP, Salesforce, you know, Google, Amazon, everyone's trying to get there. But this is a very big, complex topic that's in varying stages of maturity. So not only do they not know which standards to kind of build systems against, are you building it for the SDGs from the UN perspective? Are you building it for the World Economic Forum, GRI, CSB? What standards are you building it against? And for what regulatory environments do you have to build it for the varying clients? So it's enormously complex to actually build the metrics and the reporting systems on the back end to get that data out. And so I think that's a particular problem from the technology side. And then more broadly, as I think Amy and Kevin have rightly pointed out, there is a lot of upskilling that has to go on, but this space is constantly evolving. We've got new topics consistently emerging that are in varying stages of maturity. I think we're at a very mature point around carbon and kind of the climate discussion, where we have the Science-Based Target Initiative. We have some pretty good metrics and kind of validation around those types of issues. But you take an issue like biodiversity, which is kind of coming to the fore this year with COP15 and the Kunming conference, that is probably 10 to 15 years behind where carbon is from a measurement perspective. Like, most companies know it's an issue, but don't really know how to measure it. And so I think navigating that is a particular challenge as well. So I'm very interested to kind of see what the discussion we have here today, but hopefully Nina can provide some additional light from the 3M perspective.
Awesome. Thank you, Michael. And yeah, Nina, perfect segue for you. I mean, everyone's been talking about just the need for upskilling, and we just take time, right? Like, if we're all Batman, if we just had more time, it would all work out. We'd all train, but time is unfortunately a thing that doesn't seem to be on our side. So as someone with experience in a couple of different companies working from the inside to accelerate that change, what are some of the challenges that you are seeing with helping bring that ESG literacy to colleagues and coworkers?
Yeah, thanks for the intro. Well, actually, I think it's really interesting that we're talking about all of the upskilling that needs to be done around investors and the measurement, but there's so many other stakeholders, as Chris mentioned in his first slide, about employees and consumers. And I don't think that we can expect all of these stakeholders to get a good grasp on scope 1, 2, and 3 and all of this detail, the same way that we really can't expect all of these stakeholders to have deep financial literacy. So what are we doing to bring these KPIs to them, to make it so that people can understand what is a company doing for outcomes in ESG beyond inputs, and understanding at a glance of when there's a company they may want to work for or a company that they want to support with their wallet. So I think it's really interesting on the upskilling across the board and the different depths of that.
Awesome. Thank you, Nina. And with that, I think we'll bring all of our panelists back because we've had a variety of different perspectives here that have been shared. And would love if there are any reactions, controversial thoughts, other provocative insights that you may have heard from each other. It's always nice. Oh, hey, yeah, we all agree. But if there's any disagreement here or anything, we're like, yeah, that was an interesting nuance, and we need to flag this other facet to it. Would love to tease that out. So with that panel, any popcorn thoughts from you all?
I don't know, it seemed like we were all in violent agreement, but right, like around training and standardization and quality of the ratings. I think maybe just as it relates to the ratings, we have seen a lot of the asset managers, which are probably the main users of those ratings, really start to develop their own ratings methodology, I'll call it. And so using an MSCI or a Sustainalytics as an input to their overall process. So, they're also trying to get smarter on how to evaluate all of those ratings, especially on the active management side. On the passive management side, it's a real interesting situation, right? Where these rating agencies are essentially designing the indices and then selling them to asset managers to invest. So these ratings are really driving a lot of inflows to the capital markets.
Yeah, and someone put in the questions, who's rating the raters? And I think it's a great question because it is now, as Kevin said, it is a competitive space, not a pre-competitive space. The ratings themselves are competitive, then kind of further into the black box where that it gets further privatized into different things. So, again, I don't think necessarily disagreement is bad. It could be that one is an opportunity for, we're one organization that does understand the market better than another. It could be that. It also could be that people don't understand what they're looking at. So that's the hard part, is us trying to tease out, I think, collectively as industry, is this because we, a given company has a blind spot on an issue, or is it because, the nuance of geography, subsector, et cetera, is not being captured in the kind of standard questionnaire format that those things tend to come in. The other piece that we didn't touch on, but that is, I think, one area of opportunity, is that the kind of old school, let's call it ESG ratings, were risk ratings. And there's a new area that I would say is emerging around, opportunity space, climate transition plans as a growth engine for companies. And I think that that's a huge opportunity that we have in how financial markets can spur action in this space. But again, it requires you really knowing your stuff to be able to say, pick some winners and losers in climate and nature and equity transitions and the new reality that we're going through. So again, upskilling will be needed, but those who can do that quickly, I think, will win in the market.
And maybe just to build off Amy's point, I think part of the limitation probably a number of us are facing is that just the talent in these issue areas is very hard to come by. Like, we just don't have enough biodiversity experts, carbon experts, sustainability experts to deploy to all these organizations who need help. These are big, complex multinationals down to small organizations, and it's hard for them to actually get access to some of that knowledge. Like, you can upskill yourself to a certain point, but if you're not doing this day in and day out, it's very hard to know, like, how do you actually calculate a greenhouse gas inventory? That's harder for a lot of organizations that are smaller in scale. And so I think that's going to be an issue we're continuing to face, especially at the more senior levels, for a number of years, and so we can kind of get the talent pipeline built up a bit.
If I can jump in, Amy, I'm glad that you mentioned risks, because that's kind of one of the things that I think we may be losing sight on here, because these ESG ratings aren't just about social responsibility. It's what is the climate risk to this business? What is the customer risk of them walking away to this business? And I think as investors can think of it more as the risk of the business and the progress, then hopefully they can reward more of these positive ratings. And then maybe to build on the upskilling piece, there's so much great kind of technology and AI and tools out there that are there to help. And I think there's also a great opportunity for kind of ESG to look across at the relevant skills. Myself only having kind of worked in business for a long time and more recently gotten to sustainability, this is a business problem. This isn't an ESG problem. And so how can we leverage the relevant skills to kind of bring more people to work into ESG?
I think that's a great point. Maybe building off of Dane's commentary around like shareholder return, I think we always approach this from a value story. Like, there is a real case for sustainability from not only just pure financial metrics around operating margin and shareholder return. Like, our own kind of data analysis kind of shows that over time those companies do perform better, and I think we've seen that particularly through COVID, where they've taken actions to make supply chains more resilient. They've diversified. They've taken some of those key actions that enable them to be more agile. So I do think there is always a value story to that, and really thinking through how do you bring people from the different business units or from the product lines in to actually feel invested, that this will actually help drive their bottom line and that they as an individual can make a difference.
Well, go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to say one other thing that we can think about is that, disclosure, it's maybe goes without saying, but I'm going to say it out loud. Disclosure is a means to an end, right? Disclosure is not the end game. decision making is the end game. So, preaching to the choir on this panel, because we've got a bunch of WBCSD members, but, we've got most companies are still, I would say, operating in a disclosure for disclosure's sake kind of mindset. And I think it's, as I think it was Kevin who mentioned, like, it's the CFO making decisions about budgeting based off of this risk profile, as Nina said. Like, that's where we get to the magic of, oh, yes, my investors are going to recognize that I am managing for these issues. And so that's, I think, something that's a bit of a lagging indicator that maybe is the 2.0 version of the research presented, which is how can we start to get to assess how many of these, thousands of company years of data, how much of them are they actually making decisions this way? Is it impacting the board? So on and so forth.
This is good. If anyone does have, we've talked about this upskilling quite a few times, so I'm just going to tease this out there. If anyone does have any insights on how academia should be helping, like what are our bottlenecks, or what are the bottlenecks between us and the marketplace, or our shared bottlenecks in upskilling? Because GAP is 86 years old by this point, and it took that long for financial accounting maturity to get to where it is. I don't think we have 86 years, let alone on the climate front, if not any of these other fronts, to figure out the risks and or opportunities. So if anyone has any thoughts on time is a wicked problem, we don't have that as a luxury. How might we help accelerate really on that front? I'd love to hear from anyone on there. And if anyone in the students or the faculty or other innovators listening, by all means, please do reach out. With that, I think we've curated a number of questions from the audience. And I did see every once in a while somebody raised a hand. So if you prefer, we hadn't tried that yet, but we can see if we can get somebody in audio live from the audience. But at the very least, we've got everything that is in the Q&A, so we'll hit through that first and then go back to any hands that are still raised at that point. Professor, first question that's up, and for those who are wondering how this order is going to go, it's by People's Choice Award. So if you want to go and upvote your questions, or the ones that really resonate with you, if you haven't thrown one in, by all means, just go ahead and upvote, and we'll just keep going with the most upvoted ones first. So Professor, the first one in there is for you, but would love for any reactions from the rest of the panel. Do you really anticipate any different conclusions if you were to rerun this research based on any of the changes and emphasis of companies to more aggressively move towards ESG initiatives post 2016, since there's been so much effort on the ESG front over the last 5 years? Do you think the research is going to shift, and do you have plans really for, like Amy was talking about, kind of a version 2.0 of the research?
I mean, that's what we would hope. We would hope that over time we would start to see some of these conclusions change. The challenge we face is just to get enough data to where we can rule out all sorts of alternative explanations. It requires time to pass. So, how much time, and then to be able to finally vet it to where we feel like we're pretty confident in the conclusions. Eventually, we will probably try to run some tests like this, but honestly, I mean, talking to some of these rating agencies, I think Sustainalytics, after we published the paper, said, oh, by the way, we've just changed the way we do our ratings. So it's like, okay, great. So, it's challenging for everybody to stay on top of all the moving pieces.
Yeah, and Chris, I would add, I think, Amy, you made a really good point, right? It's nice that the rating agencies are providing ratings, but it's really about meaningful disclosure, right? So, it's no longer just sufficient to say, we made a net zero commitment, right? Like, how are you really going to achieve that, and what steps are you taking to get there by 2030 or 2040, right? And how does the market start to value in, right, those types of steps for these companies, right, over the long term here? That's going to be the important stuff.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Dane. So next one up, also kind of building a bit on the research professor. So, have you come across a relationship between greater disclosure leading to greater trust with stakeholders? It's a slightly different question than what you researched, but just curious if that came across.
If I can find some great data on how to measure whether or not people trust the information, then I would love to run that study. I don't have good data on that at the moment, so I can't really speak to that, but I think that would be very interesting to examine. If you know of any place where I get great data on that, you let me know.
Well, I was going to say, I think that there's lots of recent research, right, on how the business community, right, is more trusted by the public, as one of the key stakeholders, right? So I think it all gets back to if we had a standard way to disclose and track all of these things, we could see that we're making progress, and that would help, right? Increase the transparency, increase the trust. Right now, it's just a little bit harder given the divergence of frameworks and metrics all over the place.
So this next question will bring this up to the panel as a whole. Some of the recent and very public expressions of disagreements with Unilever's commitments to the SDGs. Is that a storm in a teacup? So how do these public comments affect other companies and leaders who are trying to navigate through this balance?
Yeah, and that's a tricky one, certainly for Unilever. I mean, they've been at this for a long time, though. I mean, it started with Paul Pullman with the Sustainable Living Plan a decade or more ago. So they've been at it for a long time. I think some of the criticism of Unilever, like they're using sustainability as the scapegoat, more or less. I think they have some core business issues that are probably more underpinning this than the sustainability stuff, in my view. But I think it is all like you can't sacrifice one for the other in the end. I mean, if you look at products, right, most consumers are not willing to pay too much more for a sustainable product, especially if it doesn't do the job just as good. And Nina can probably comment on this better than I can. But you look at brands like Method and others, like they have to be able to perform just as good as more traditional products. And so I think you can't trade off one for the other. And that's probably the criticism like Alan Jope and Unilever are getting right now is, push really hard on sustainability, but you kind of not focus as much on the kind of the core fundamentals of the business.
Yeah, and maybe kind of adding on that, I think it is too bad to see this criticism because we are at such a pivotal moment of companies being willing to make bold commitments and take these risks and then have the markets follow and see these trailblazers that are going to make a difference take the risk to do that, which is something that Unilever did a long time ago. But I think since their strategy and their plans are so deep, I like to believe they'll come out ahead on this one.
Just one other, just a different way of articulating what Michael said, but you have to do E, S, and G at the same time. And G means financials too. So that's the trick. Yep.
So I think, Amy, building on that, the next question from Sean actually teased that up fairly well. Is there anything you think companies can do to lean forward proactively rather than react post-mortem to findings? So this applies obviously to the disclosures and investor side, but also I think Nina, like you've teed up for customers or employees or others, right? So this I think applicable to each of the stakeholder groups that we've touched on. So Amy, you want to take first stabs at this?
Sure. Yeah. These are people. So you can have conversations with your investors about these things. So if they're calling you, answer the phone. It's amazing many people don't. Part of that is you have to build relationships internally with your CFO, investor relations, all of these things. You need to be able to speak to the business as well as the sustainability. When you were talking about the pipeline, Chris, and what can academics do, you got to be fluent in all of this together, right? Which is, I think, the intent of this particular party. But, often we have folks who are one area or the other, right? You can't, if you're in business, you have to be able to translate. And that includes translating with your investors and explaining to them, well, yes, I see that you're looking at the Sustainalytics metrics. Here's why that doesn't quite paint the right picture for our particular context. So I think there's a proactive relationship building education you can do one-on-one, as well as then get involved in organizations like this one, like ours, like others that are doing that kind of pre-competitive space of how do we start to tackle these big thorny issues together, and have those conversations with financial institutions, with regulators, so we can start to rise those areas of challenge or rub before they get solidified into forever policy. So, it takes work though. So, you have to be ready for that.
Awesome. Well, maybe kind of building on that point, Kevin, I think to you or back to Dane, I have a question from our own Professor C.B. Bhattacharya. Is there an optimal level of disclosure? Is there some amount that companies should be thinking about for each of these different stakeholders, at the very least investors, if not others?
So I think I would start with the company really should try and figure out what their material issues are, right, in their particular industry or sector, right? And then that will drive where they want to focus their time, what metrics they should be responding to, and then that will, again, drive the disclosure that they want to make. So again, like, I'm not sure there's an optimal amount of disclosure. More is better than none, right? But I think it's about meaningful disclosure and making progress against the goals that the CEO and the leadership team are really setting as it relates to sustainability.
Yeah, I would agree that there's really not necessarily some optimal level that I could speak to. I would agree that materiality should drive all of those decisions, because really, going back to the point of it should help with decision making for the business. Hopefully, what's helpful for running the business well should be informative to the stakeholders of the business. The risk you might run is if you require companies to disclose everything, is that maybe that might provide information that harms the business itself by empowering competitors, right? Which might make companies less inclined to invest in trying to address these issues. I mean, so we don't want to go and over disclose and harm businesses in the process to where they stop investing and trying to address these issues. So it's a thorny issue, but I think as long as we focus on materiality, we should be in good shape.
Perfect. Next one we have probably tease up a bit, maybe Nina, some of your experience, Michael's, but probably the whole panel and Professor yours as well. Because I think you had one slide in there earlier, just disclosures and ESG scores, right? Or ratings. So one of our audience members is wondering if there is any correlation between the firms disclosing more and the same firms making greater efforts in ESG metrics. So are they getting better? Is disclosure helping them get better? Is it helping lead to better decision making, like the intent, like the game plan is, or is there still a bit of a disconnect there?
I would say there's still some disagreement. We're seeing performance improving over time. So I think firms are, but I can't say that's tied necessarily to the disclosure. Getting at the causality of that is really, really messy.
Yeah, I wish I had a better answer, but I think Dane hit it. Like, we can't really do that direct correlation. I think we are seeing better ESG performance, and those companies are typically stronger, but whether it's exactly related to disclosure, I'm not entirely sure.
I think there is an aspect of what gets measured, what gets managed, and so as companies are focusing on these areas and they're bringing that to the surface, they're working more on it. But as has been mentioned here, the challenge in keeping on kind of benchmarking and the transparency on progress is also something that companies are dealing with as a trade-off. So it's hard to know yet.
Kind of on that hard to know point, Professor, another question for you from the audience, but again, also love any other insights from the panel and the experience. Did you explore in which any ESG issues with, did you explore in which issues was ESG performance disagreement larger? So there were particular thematics where the disagreement verged more than others. So, we might think of some topics as being more socially sensitive or politicized or polarizing, whereas others may be more agreeable, like pollution is bad or child labor is bad, or things like that. So just getting a sense for the spectrum there.
We didn't go too deep into this area, but where we saw the greatest disagreement was related to the social issues. And so this might relate to employees. It could relate to safety issues at companies. It could be child labor, it could be bribery. I mean, there's a lot of things that you might include in that, but some of that you might include in governance. It gets a little messy, but that's where we saw most of the disagreement. There's less disagreement where we have clear standards. So, relatively the environment, there's a little bit more agreement on that than there is on the social issues.
Sure. Maybe I think from some of our conversations we were talking about, there might even be disagreements around just like, how do you measure, like what are the most basic ways to measure your your emissions in a relevant way, right? So, thinking beyond investors, do you think that like, yeah, hey, everyone's pretty set on climate and it's really everything else, the S is really where the space is, or are there even still environmental issues that we're having wide disagreement on?
Yeah, and I don't even know if it's disagreement, but it's things like operational boundaries. So when we're talking about something like greenhouse gas emissions, if you are a company that is not vertically integrated versus a company who is vertically integrated, you're going to have slightly different numbers. And so how do you compare those numbers, whether it's on greenhouse gas emissions, whether it's on social? But you're in the same competitive set from the investor perspective. You're all snack food companies or whatever, right? So it's an interesting thing. You need to understand how greenhouse gas accounting works, how it applies to these different companies, therefore what you can expect the implications to be, because we're using an operational boundary of the company's ownership most of the time, rather than end-to-end emission profile of products or what your suite of products are, and the more complicated your company is. If you are a huge company with a whole bunch of different divisions and, you've got everything from food to automotive, that number of greenhouse gas per dollar revenue means nothing. So I think that's the challenge in interpreting the data. How you measure it, there might be consensus on, although improvements underway around, land use change and whatnot. But, it's how you interpret, because data is into insights into action. So, if there's that whole middle bit that we have to continue to do, and then it's just worse on social. It's all of that plus then worse. So, it's a lot of question marks still out there on how to interpret this. Child labor is a great example. Is that about your employees? Because that's not really a risk for Fortune 500 in the US, generally speaking. But it's in the risk of the supply chain. So, it's really challenging around how, everyone might define things slightly differently. Exposure to risk on something like child labor is a great example of it's more complicated than a child labor bad.
Yep. Awesome. And I think maybe that tees up a lot of, it's not just that the company has to be better in articulating to each of these different stakeholders, it's that we also need to upskill each of these different stakeholders as well. Like the investors need more understanding and more nuance about how to work with these kinds of companies. The consumers need better guidance. The employees or prospective employees need better guidance.
And tens of thousands of suppliers.
Yes. Yep. And to that point, that actually is a perfect transition to our next question. So how do you all foresee, how large do you foresee the impact of policymakers to level the playing field? So, is that going to, help nullify any kind of cost advantage of, for example, conventional suppliers versus a sustainable or more sustainable supply chain?
I think advocacy and policy engagement is so critical to being able to, what I think of as like move the bell curve, right? So it's not so much about like, I think there's going to be natural market-based rewards for first movers and laggards and some of these things, but how do you move the bell curve? That's through policy. And so it's a key piece of the puzzle. And then how do you do that well is yet another challenge. And so that's part of, why I really feel like groups like this, pre-competitive groups where we're saying it's not about us versus them, it's about how do we do this the right way? How do we do it without adding too much complexity? How do we do it with kind of a science, planet first main approach, while still not bogging down the system to make it so challenging that no one can comply. It's why we all need to come together and work together on these issues.
Michael, I know that you've got a lot of experience working with folks trying to integrate data and perspectives from across, so I'm sure you have some insights about supply chains.
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe just to build on Amy's point around policymakers, I think part of it is we got to create a floor, because a lot of companies, like they just need to get to a base point. And some of them we're gonna have to drag along. Like we've got leaders like Unilever, others we're gonna drag kicking and screaming, and that has to be done via regulatory environments. And so I think that's one thing we're gonna have to do from a policy perspective, just try to create that level playing field, at least at a baseline. Regarding value chains, I mean, I think to the points we've kind of discussed here, you're dealing with thousands or tens of thousands of suppliers. I mean, it is immensely tough to think about scope 3 and scope 2 emissions kind of across that. And honestly, I have yet to meet anyone who's figured out the scope 3 puzzle, candidly. We haven't figured it out. If any of you have figured it out, please do let me know. But I think it's continuing to be a struggle, and it will be for the next little while until we can figure out how do you actually address that for things that are not really within your direct control. We've got some interesting ideas, and a lot of people are testing different concepts around it, but the value chain will be a tricky one for a long time to come for us.
And I think, Chris, I'd add and build on those points, right? I think the policy piece is also very important from making sure that a lot of these solutions haven't been developed yet, right? So, with a policy to help spur innovation and develop new technology to solve some of these complex problems, like that'll be a big impetus for companies to move faster, right? And also potentially help with a just transition, right? I mean, if there's some policies that will make that better, companies maybe are more apt to move quicker. So
we got 2 questions left, a little bit of like lightning time. So see if we can pack these both up and get everyone off before we all turn into pumpkins here when the lunch break ends or the morning coffee wears off, depending on where you are across the continent, or for those internationally who might need to turn in. First, what is the role of ISO standards? What role do they play in ESG ratings and practices? So the 26 and the 14 families are supposed to be standard for ESG practices. 26 may not be certifiable, but are these helpful? What role do you see ISO playing in that? And then, Professor, there is one to you specifically on why is disagreement viewed as negative? For example, the credit swaps were a serious contributing factor to the 2008 crisis, and they were all uniform in one way, but that kind of led to a bad outcome. So that's one targeted question to you, but first, would love from the panel any thoughts on ISOs.
Yeah, I may be happy to hit the ISO one. So I think, listen, any control framework, right, that management wants to implement is always a good positive factor. I think from an ESG perspective, we don't usually see that as one of the most prevalent frameworks that's being used out there, at least in the US. So I'd maybe encourage, some of the others, them to look at some of the other frameworks in addition to that.
A lot of nods on that one. So Professor, over to you for the last one.
So regarding disagreement, we honestly view disagreement as a good thing. Like some amount of disagreement is fine. But if it gets too large, it could undermine confidence in ESG information altogether. And that's what we're worried about. And if we saw that, that might lead people to start disinvesting in this area, saying it's unimportant because nobody can figure it out. So that's where we would see that as a problem.
Awesome. Well, I think that basically brings us right to time. So with that, we'd love to thank the panel for the great insights. Thank you, Professor, for the provocative research. Thank you to the audience for the really great questions. There were lots of hey, we need to upskill, or we ourselves need to upskill. So I know that the World Business Council has lots of great resources on that are often public. I know each of the folks here from their companies often have lots of great thought leadership pieces. I know we at the Center for Sustainable Business are also doing a lot in offerings for folks to upskill. So looking forward to continuing the conversation, and we will catch you all at that next conversation. Thank you, everybody. Take care. Have a good one.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.